You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Monday evening, everyone. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's ODYSY1.com for those of you who want to tune in for just the audio version. If you want to see the simulcast video, go over to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Mr. all spelled out. I think we've got that down now after 6 weeks of saying the same thing. So thanks for being here tonight. It's Monday, and up here in the frozen tundra of Minnesota, Wisconsin, where I live, I'm in Wisconsin, just right across the border from the Minnesota border, and so about an hour, little less than an hour from the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. The misnomer is that it is frozen tundra up here year-round. We do get early winters. We sometimes, many years, we've had Halloween blizzards. I remember that. I didn't remember that as a kid, but now that I'm an adult, it seems we have more snow on Halloween as an early blizzard. And every year we hope it's going to be a little nicer to take the kids out this year. So we'll see this year, but I know it's going to be a cool winter. They are predicting a very cold winter up here. And so right now, today, it's going to be about 85 degrees and really hot and humid. But tomorrow, we have a big cold front coming in. It's going to drop us down into the 50s. And it's going to be in the 50s for highs all week. So there's autumn kicking in. We have up here what they call Indian summer. So usually late in October, it'll jump up into really warm temps and then fall right back down, and we have our Halloween blizzard. So I hope it's nice in your neck of the woods. I hope you're having good weather. I hope you're enduring the whole impeachment BS that's going on right now. You can see my personal opinion shines through whenever I talk about that. This show is not about politics, but I will say I just want to see him get this over with, one way or the other. I believe the House will vote to impeach him no matter what. They just had to find a good reason that they could hang their hat on. And, of course, with all the work and struggle they've been trying to do to remove this president for 3 years, they now finally have found their hook. And that is what came out about a week to 10 days ago with the whistleblower, which is a big nothing burger, but they're going to make it into something. There's going to be debate and discussion over that. But they'll find their way, and you will find that mostly along party lines, the House will vote to impeach the president. But then it'll go to the Senate, and the Senate will quash it along mostly party lines. So it's a big undertaking. It's not good for the country to ever do it. Benjamin Franklin once said, impeachment is the legal way to assassinate a president. So there you go. You can take that and put that in your hat. And if you are for impeachment, I suggest you read a little deeper and study a little deeper and find out what this is really all about. If you don't like Trump, that's just too damn bad. There are presidents I didn't like, but you don't find ways to remove them from office that are so, pardon the pun, trumped up that it doesn't really mean anything. You diminish the value of the constitutional right to impeach a president when it is on the heels of 3 years of trying to find any way under the blue sky to impeach or to remove from office or to delegitimize. So put that all in your pipe and smoke it as you're watching the news, and write your senators, write your congressmen, let them know what you think. And so with that being my only political statement this morning, and I only make it because it's just fresh. Every time I turn on the news, every time I look at something online, there's something new, some new twist about why everybody else has done the same thing the president has, why the president, in his request to the Russian president, wasn't put to have an opponent removed, but rather to have somebody that's had high office investigated after 3 years of nothing, of nobody doing anything about it. So you can look at that stuff and weigh it out for yourself. So sorry to make any kind of political statement on this show at all, but as you will know, when we're here talking about Star Trek right now, one of my favorite life things is Star Trek, has been since I was a kid. You will note that a lot of current politics and a lot of current morality issues, a lot of current social issues were always dealt with in Star Trek. So I would love to see how they would handle something like this in an episode. What's going on in our country today. So support your country. Support the sitting president, whether you like him or not. I didn't like President Obama. I did not like his political ideologies. I agreed with him on maybe 1 or 2 points throughout his entire 8 years as the president. But I always respected the office. And there you go. Let's leave it at that. I'll go off if I don't stop. So we've been talking about Captain Kirk, and you can tell that he is my favorite character, that he was my hero by the amount of time we've spent on it. I got an email message from somebody, a listener, over the weekend, who said they hadn't really watched the original series, and they just watched an episode. It was the Doomsday Machine, for those of you who are in Star Trek and into Star Trek and know which episode that was. And he said because of this little series we've been doing on Kirk, he was able to watch Kirk and watch the episode and enjoy it from a very different standpoint. And again, I gotta say, compared to, because I opened up talking about something going on in current politics today in our country, you look around the world, there's a whole hell of a lot more important issues than Star Trek. But I also think we need literature, we need things like Star Trek, that not as distractions, but the things to remind us that there's more to life than the bad stuff going on around us. And that's where I think Star Trek becomes very important. And it was important to me, as you heard many times, heard me saying, before this show started on Odyssey, I also did something, a show about some of my own personal stuff, my own psychological links to Kirk. These are things that are important to us. So I think it's kind of fun and important to sometimes take the heroes that we have, that we've raised up, and try to find out what about them makes them heroes to us. Why should we? I got a light that's, those of you who are not viewing the simulcast cannot see this. I'm struggling with one of my studio lights here that just flopped on me. It had momentary erectile dysfunction, shall we put it that way? And so it's now fixed. So those of you watching, that's what I was fumbling with over here to the left. So let's continue on talking about Captain Kirk. And I have got a little bit more information I want to cover with him. We were talking about the shadow side. And let's just recap, because it was Friday that we talked about this. There's that integration of shadow in anybody's personality types. These are the things, they're the least developed functions that we have, the least developed that's available to our consciousness. And the same was made with Kirk. If you look at him, there were things about his person. They had to make him a real person. If you don't take a literary character or a fictitious character and build into them real personality traits, what do they become? They become comic book characters of themselves. And Kirk was made real by the writers who instilled this stuff in him, by William Shatner, who I'm sure incorporated things into his character as the character grew, and probably even more so. You got to think and put this in context. Star Trek was a series in the 1960s. It was fairly low budget, with those gorgeous sets from the 60s built out of plastic and balsa wood. It was something that was meant to be an action show for people, science fiction action. But from the very get-go, Roddenberry, the creator, had written into the show things that were very deep, so much so that first premiere, first pilot episode with Captain Pike, the Cage, was rejected because the censors at CBS said far too cerebral for the American public. Could you imagine that nowadays? If somebody, how would you feel? Would you feel a bit insulted if somebody said, well, we rejected that TV series because we thought it was too smart for you? So, but this is the way they did things in the 60s. And a television show like that, these were actors who were picked up for this show, and I think they were surprised it lasted a season, 2 seasons, and got into the beginning of their 3rd season. And they only went a half a season before they were finally canceled, after a big write-in campaign from fans between 2nd season and 3rd season, which resurrected it. But these were actors that after Star Trek was done, it's done. They're moving on. They moved on into other things. You saw William Shatner. Do you remember the series Barbary Coast? If you don't remember that, look it up. It was with, I can't remember his name. I see his face in my mind. But they were, I think, casino owners in the Old West in San Francisco, something like that, over in California somewhere, and all the adventures and spy stuff they got into in that time period. That was a great show. I think it lasted a season. You saw Shatner come back in T.J. Hooker. You saw several different incarnations of what he did. I think T.J. Hooker, however, was during and after they had already resurrected the movies. So what you saw was a 12-year gap in between the old series and the first motion picture. And I read an article with William Shatner once back. It was a while after the first movie had come out. He said he was surprised that it was picked up, that this movie was being done, and he was elated along with other members of the cast. And he said he did his very best to get in the best shape he had ever been in life, because this is him going on the big screen with a series that had been canceled and had died out, but a fire was lit under it in syndication. And it became world-renowned, this show, and so did Captain Kirk. And so he said he was in the best shape of his life. Go take a look at him. Even though he had the bad toupee with the big, fluffy late 70s, early 80s hair, it grew on us after a while. And something I didn't know, I thought Shatner, not that it's an important point, but all through the series in the 60s, he wore a hairpiece. That was his hair. I thought it was his hair. You could see the hairline and everything, but he wore a hairpiece. Probably because he had hair like mine that was, looks good from one angle, but you tip your head and you see all the bald coming through. I have the weirdest ass bald spot. Somebody says, oh, you got male pattern balding. And I look at it and I go, no, I got like freak pattern balding. I got weirdest ass bald spot on the back of my head that I've ever seen. And so this is why Shatner, I think, probably wore a wig and a toque, a hairpiece, in almost everything he did. But in that 1979 release of Star Trek The Motion Picture, which could have been titled, I think, a little better than Motion Picture, you had William Shatner in probably what he called the best shape of his life. And he was about 50 years old when that movie came out. He's 84, I think, today, in 79. So he would have been 54, somewhere in that range, when that movie came out. So take a look at him. There's hope for us old guys that are getting older. You can still get in great shape. So let's move on. So in the movies, Kirk evolved. He developed. And it was good to see this side of him because it humanized Kirk while we still idolized and hero worshipped, quote unquote, the captain. And so this whole thing of integrating shadow is where we left off. And we talked about the archetypes of the ego-dystonic functions. This is what verifies Kirk's type, his personality type. It guides us as we follow his journey of shadow function development. For Kirk, the opposing personality archetype would correspond to his introverted intuition, as we've talked about over days. And it threw up barriers, resistance at every turn in the form of his own self-doubt, his self-criticisms, his distrust of his own intuitive process. The opposing personality function can be really difficult to detect, and it might be recognized first as a projection onto others. We saw this. Commander Spock repeatedly blocks Kirk. He cock-blocks Kirk on a lot of stuff with logic, and he inhibited his impulsivity, Kirk's impulsivity, with a calm, with a logic, with irrefutable logic. And he constantly was reminding Kirk of both the letter of the law, the ethical intent behind them, the rules and the regulations. Spock was like Kirk's conscience, his outward conscience in the storylines. And it played into Kirk's weaknesses when Spock would have to do that with his captain and his friend. And sometimes Kirk became frustrated in the movies, the J.J. Abrams movies. You saw him becoming enraged with Spock, and that there was a split in their burgeoning friendship before it actually became the friendship we knew. It had to build into that. But I remember in the first of the J.J. Abrams movies, where Kirk has been ejected out into space onto a planet. He's on an ice planet. They're going to have to pick him up later. And he encounters the old Spock with the time travel issue. And it was Spock that really told him, I can't reveal the future, he says. But in essence, what he was telling him was, you and I will be the best of friends. And you have to make that happen. And so that gave Kirk something different when he re-encountered the young Spock in his own timeline. And in Star Trek Into Darkness, Kirk sets out on a mission of revenge to assassinate Khan. And it's Spock who really calls him off of that. He's stubborn, he's overly conservative, he's cautious, he's dogmatic, he's inflexible, he's obdurate. But he benefits from the dynamic that he has with Spock, and perhaps begins to gain some capacity to regulate himself from within. He stands in greater integrity with his own highest nature. He urgently reminds Kirk, Spock does, that such an enterprise of assassination of Khan is inconsistent with values and laws of the Federation, and would amount to no more than another act of murder. And he's appealing to Kirk's the inner Kirk, the shadow of Kirk that wants this vengeance. And although we see him struggling to give up his cherished vision of destroying Khan and avenging the death of Pike, Kirk internalizes Spock's warnings, and he resolves instead to capture Khan and bring him to justice. And so in this way, Kirk's encounter with the opposing personality archetype within himself, as personified in Spock, helps him remain true to himself and his own deeply held ideals, overcoming this whole inflation of his hero archetype. And we witness Kirk maturing and gaining greater self-control in the process. And when we apply this stuff to us, do you ever find yourself in a position where you have to do something that is different than what you want to do? Have you ever been there? I'm going to use a personal example. It's not to pat myself on the back. And those of you who are familiar with my radio show and familiar with me, I've talked about this or around this before. There was an issue back many years ago when my now 27-year-old daughters were 7 years old. So this is a good 20 years ago. My ex-wife and I were separated, and there was good reason for me to file divorce. And I remember the pastor calling me one day and saying, "Your wife is over at our house and would like to meet with you." And so I showed up, and I was on the path to having sole custody of my kids, which ultimately I gained, because even this story I'm going to tell you fell apart a bit. But I got there, and she was the only one there. And I think they were in another part of the house, the pastor and his wife. And so I remember it was my ex-wife who had lied about me, claimed I was abusing her, claimed I was abusing my children, had hidden my children away from me in a shelter. I didn't see my kids for 4 months. All of this stuff was going on. And by the way, this is a little further back because they weren't 7 at the time. This is when they were 3 years old. And I remember all of this stuff, and I fought, and the judge was going to give me sole custody. And so this was the week after that happened, where the path to that was already being set in court. And I met with my ex-wife, and she sat down on the floor at my feet and practically begged me to forgive her. Can you forgive me for the way I have been, for what I've done? She also had an affair in there. So there was an affair. There was all the false stuff to try to win custody. And I said, I looked at her, and you know what my natural inclination was? Did you ever see the old James Cagney from the black and white movies in the late 30s where he took the grapefruit and smashed it into the woman's face and pushed her? That's almost what I felt like. My natural inclination was to put my boot to her cheek and push her over and walk out. And that's the darker side of my personality. It's like, F you, I want nothing to do with you. Look what you have done, not just to me, but to our children. You can go find your happiness wherever you want, but it ain't going to be here, lady. That was what was inside of me. Instead, I tried to sink that darker nature. And I looked at her and I said, you've already been forgiven. I said, you're already forgiven. I said, our kids deserve to have you and I make this work. I said, so yeah, I'm on board. I said, but there are caveats. We have to do this. We have to do this. We have to seek counseling. We have to do, and so on and so forth. So, and it went well for a while. And it wasn't until my kids were 7 years old that it eventually broke out. So another 3 to 4 years went by, and it finally just degraded because it didn't work. There wasn't a heart change on the other side. And I found that throughout all the time I was granted sole custody of my children. I was a single dad with 3 kids at home, full-time. And the ex-wife presented herself as a constant thorn in the side to our family. And there were many times I could have kicked her to the curb in many other ways, and I found myself offering the olive branch all the time because I felt my kids deserved to have that. Parents, I'm going to give you this. I know this is about Captain Kirk, and we're way afield here, but I'm illustrating a point. If you're in a situation where you are separated and you have children, you're separated from your spouse, you might hate that other person. But you know what? Your kids need to see you get along for their benefit, to know that you are both actively loving and supporting your children the best way you can, even if the marriage isn't surviving. So that's what I did all the way through. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying we have that darker shadow side of our nature that might want to act one way, but we have to put that in check. And we saw Kirk doing this all the time, and it matured him. It gained him greater self-control in the process. And we're going to pick this up when we come back, because we're at the end, believe it or not, of the first segment. So you sit there. I'll be gone for a couple of minutes. I'll be back. Stay tuned. All right, folks, welcome back from that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program, if you didn't know that already. And you can hear the audio and find the links to all the different sources on iTunes, iHeartRadio, the different terrestrial stations, and so on by going to Odyssey1.com. That's ODYSY1.com. You can also watch the video simulcast of this broadcast over on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Join the live chat room there. And if you have not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. And then hit the little bell, and you'll get notifications over there from YouTube. So let's pick up where we left off with Kirk. This whole archetype that we're talking about, this darker side, then opens up to what's called the witch. Senex. We talked about this the other day, and I'm just going to recap a little bit here. And it applies to Kirk's extroverted feeling, function, attitude. The witch Senex function is described as manipulative in service to its own agenda. I don't know why they call it the witch, but it's manipulative in service to its own agenda. It's capable of identifying and attacking other people exactly where they're the most vulnerable and weak. Perhaps by today's standards, you would say the witch element of this in the name only has to do with being able to cast the spell where you need to and work the magic and pull the elements out that are sometimes hidden elements. And so exactly where you're most vulnerable and weak is where you can attack. And it's critical of both one's own and others' capacities as caretakers. And it's the opposing personality. The witch Senex can be most visible in a projection on another person. In this case, it was Admiral Marcus. Marcus spoke to Kirk in a fatherly way, calling him son, but it was just a masquerade for his condescending, dismissive attitude. And Kirk manages to withstand everything from Marcus, the blasts from Marcus, and although his inflated self-confidence is shaken at the core, Kirk still takes another step on the path to integrating his shadow by refusing to crumble or compromise. I will not do this. You saw it in Picard as well, when he said, "The line is drawn here. We will not cross this line." And he refuses to do what he knows he has to do because he thinks he can still overcome this. So Kirk gains some awareness of his own tendency to manipulate the facts to suit his agenda. And he begins to recognize the serious implications of that behavior. So then there's also, we talked about the trickster element, that Kirk kind of reinforces this whole dark side of himself through his introverted thinking function. And according to the function archetype of the trickster, this may show up as a tendency to subvert or manipulate logic in order to justify an action or a position or bend the truth to fit a desired outcome or a rationale. Have you ever done that? I've done it. I've caught myself doing it. There are times where I have to go, I have to bend the truth here. I have to manipulate this situation in order to make it work right. I think and I believe I'm still in the honest right, but you sometimes have to cross over into that shadow land in order to make other people understand what you're doing. That's a manipulation, and it's a manipulation that comes through. And sometimes people don't get it unless you do that. I understand the use of the incorporation of the dark side of that shadow thing. And there's several instances in which Captain Kirk appears to be acting under the influence of the trickster. He uses faulty logic or irrational arguments to defend what he judges to be right, and according to his values. But he's clouded by this intensity of emotions and his desires. So at the beginning of Star Trek Into Darkness, that movie, Kirk is command of the Enterprise, and he violates the Prime Directive, and he interferes with the native population. And then he intervenes to save the planet. And what he does is warranted in light of the situation. This is how he justified it. It's his subjective calculus of his own deeds and his own actions. But even Pike calls him out for this. And Kirk tries to defend his position. He artfully suppresses the truth by playing with the facts and telling only a part of the story. And when Pike catches in the deception, thank you, Mr. Spock, this is what caused the rift right there between Kirk and Spock. Kirk discounts the significance of the event and argues that it was necessary in order, and he justifies it. We all have done that. So, as an unconscious function, the shadow, the trickster, the witch, all of these things may show up in projection on another person. And this is most clearly exhibited in Khan, in that movie especially. A complex and at times ambiguous character. It shows up where Kirk says to Spock in one of the older movies, The Undiscovered Country. Spock says, I mentioned this last time, Spock says, the Klingons are dying, Jim. And Kirk says, let them die. And he blames them for the death of his son, and he blames them for this. And this is who he's been battling his whole career, and now they need his help. And he doesn't want to give it at first. So, another intriguing aspect of the trickster archetype is the proposition that it provides an avenue to gain access to the anima, to the animus. It integrates the interior function, thereby opening the gate to exodystonic functions. It builds this bridge from the conscience, or the conscious to the unconscious parts of the personality. It's bridge building in probably not so good a way. It's a way we justify our overt actions by hailing to that manipulative part of us that can find ways to justify what we do, even when we know it's not what we're supposed to do. And so Kirk is incorrigible in his sexual escapades. He's relentless in his reflexive flirtation, and apparently any female he encounters in the course of both the movies and in the series, both in the movies and in the series, no particular woman emerges as the anima figure, which is kind of this feminine presence, so to speak. And I'm not a big believer in the masculine and feminine of a person. I think what looks like to some people as true as the feminine side of a man's nature is really true masculinity at work. It's that which latches onto other aspects of the personality and overcomes the bad ones, the shadow ones. Kirk projects this energy onto the Enterprise. That's his greatest love. That is his one passion in life. So, let's move on to one that we didn't hit already. Now that we've spent almost 2/3 of the show recapping some things. Kirk's confrontation with the archetype of the demon, as it's called. It's extroverted sensation. It works to bring Kirk to the brink of despair and undermines all of his ego strengths at their core. And buried at the farthest reaches of the unconscious, the archetype in this position is experienced as alien, as uncontrollable, as sometimes non-existent. It has the impersonal quality that manifests as this inexorable, crushing force that's relentlessly bearing down to destroy Kirk's ship, the Enterprise, and Kirk's crew. And so, Khan can also be seen as the carrier of this energy. Once he appears to have been outmaneuvered by Kirk and Spock, and when he realizes he's failed to secure the freedom and safety of his people, he devolves into a maniacal and elemental embodiment of pure evil with a blind rage that's fixated on annihilation. In The Wrath of Khan, we had a different version of this story being told in that different original timeline, which showed Khan as vengeful. That was his whole process. When he found out that the Enterprise was there and that Kirk was there, it changed everything about him. That became the whole focus of his life. And the way Kirk deals with him is a great view into this darker side also of Kirk, as well as the command side. I love the things that Kirk did. I love the manipulation that he used when Khan says, I give you 2 minutes. Give 2 minutes to you and your gallant crew. Oh, wait, that might have been the Klingon in Search for Spock. But Khan says Kirk is like trying to find the code so they can take down the other ship's shields, Khan's ship. And as he's doing that, he pulls out his glasses, and he's got to put on his glasses because he's aging. And he looks at Khan and he says, how do we know you'll keep your end of the bargain? And Khan says, basically tells him, you have no guarantee. And so Kirk says, okay, here it comes. And so he lies to Khan, manipulates in order to make the right happen. As he saw, and he had to lower his shield so they could fire on him. And so we have seen the aspects of this behavior in Kirk at times when his righteous fury and the wounds of loss have led him to lose his humanity and descend into brutish, violent behavior that takes control of him and overcomes his higher nature with a drive for vengeance and destruction. Have any of you had situations like that in your life? Maybe none of us have had that extreme tragedy where we are the leader, of course, in this fictional storyline. Kirk's the leader and he sees the destruction. He sees the death of people around him, the possible destruction of his ship. And it moves him into this drive for vengeance, for destruction. He sees the loss of life. Have any of you been in that case? I know a handful of people who have been in that case where there's loss of life, loss of a loved one, and they merge into violence and vengeful behavior. I was there myself. I mentioned last week my mother was shot in the chest by her estranged husband who went on the lam back in 1999. It took 10 months to find him. My mother survived, but I can tell you what, I was told in no uncertain terms by the FBI, if this guy shows up at your house, he said, you shoot to kill. You don't ask questions. He said, you don't try to appeal to the better angels of his nature. He says, you dot your I. And he told me that's 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. He says, just make sure we find some kind of weapon in his hand. And I can't tell you who said that to me. No, don't want to get anybody in trouble. Later. But this is what I was told to do. And this was somebody I knew. And I probably would have tried to appeal to him. But he also made threats to me and my children after he had shot my mom. And so I was on the watch out. I would stay up many nights with a gun across my lap, waiting for him to show up at my house. And the neighbors, and we lived way out in the country. We had a ranch at the time, a horse ranch. So we're way out in the middle of nowhere, and I had the neighbors tell me, hey, we saw this little red car pull in. And that was him, while we were all gone at work and the kids were at school. And so there was that need for vengeance at that time, and that need to stop him. But I kept trying to make the better side of my nature overcome the darker side. I remember going out with some friends and looking for him at local dives. Now, of course, common sense would tell you he probably wasn't at his local dives because he was a wanted man for having shot my mother. But we went out looking for him. Don't know what we would have done if we'd have found him. Probably dragged his ass to jail. But I cannot say that the darker side of my nature did not want to overtake me. So at the climax of the film we're talking about here, Into Darkness, Kirk appears to be externalized and channeled through Khan. When it appears that all is lost and the Enterprise is about to disintegrate as it plummets into Earth's atmosphere, Kirk loses the last vestige of his brash self-confidence and he hands over command to Spock, saying, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. I only know what I can do. And left with nothing but his own determination to do everything in his power to save the ship and crew, Kirk transcends the demonic archetype. He breaks through to the daimonic archetype, the daimonic aspect of extroverted sensation. He uses his body to realign the grid and save the ship and the crew, sacrificing his own life in the process. This is the flip-flop of what happened to Spock in Wrath of Khan. And so in the extreme sense of the desperate situation, Kirk goes beyond his limitations. He admits, I don't know what to do, but he knows what he has to do. In other words, I don't know what to do to save my own life while saving the life of those around me and my ship. But he goes and does what he needs to do. He embraces the shadow qualities. He emerges through this literal resurrection as a wiser and more fully integrated personality. And finally ready to take command of his beloved starship. One thing I don't like about Into Darkness is that it really shows Kirk evolving in his personality type because he died and they were able to bring him back. And this changes him. In the original timeline, Kirk evolved by growing and learning things. Not because he was brought back from the dead and his higher functions start to kick back in. And he sees it. Now, all is a learning process, of course, but Kirk learned either way, either of these timelines you look at. So in his ultimate sacrifice, we see all of his function attitudes operating at a high level and in harmony. He refuses to accept a no-win situation, and he's determined to do the impossible. He adheres to his own code of justice with a deeply felt and personal sense of authenticity and integrity. He demonstrates supreme leadership and commitment to the responsibilities of command, which, in this instant, was almost him going down with the ship and saving his crew. It's that whole thing that came up in Wrath of Khan, the needs of the many versus the needs of the one. And he experiences, to correct the physical problem, this is the knowledge he has. He uses his accumulated knowledge to correct the physical problem that's disabling the ship. He's gained access to the ego-dystonic, unconscious parts of his personality as well. He becomes a savior without ego, without inflation of ego. He acts from an awareness that transcends the individual. He makes the supreme sacrifice of his own life for the sake of his crew, and he defies the odds and rejects defeat with a radical action that disregards conventional limitations. I don't know all of your stories personally, but maybe some of you have been in that position where you have had to step over that line knowing you are probably going to lose your life to save others. I know my own brother, and he's not my blood brother. He was our brother because he became friends with my mother and our family, and over the years became closer than a brother. He died about 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. And he had been taken, when he was in Iraq, he had been taken as a prisoner. He was tortured, and he bore the PTSD of that. But he was also had a doctorate 2 times over. He was an intelligent man. This is why he was almost drafted back in, because of his experience and intelligence. And this guy was a phenomenal person. He was a hero. Do you know heroes? And he eventually succumbed to different wounds that he had gotten over the years, and different things he was exposed to over the years. I'm not getting into that. That's a whole nother topic. But let me ask you, do you know somebody, or have you been a person who has had to say, I have to come to terms with something, and I've got to step across that line of sacrifice in order to save those around me? This is what Kirk did. And he's resurrected as this wholly integrated, mature person, seasoned by his encounter with death and despair, possessing a broader, more inclusive perspective and an inspiring zest for life. At last, Kirk has truly earned the respect and the loyalty of his crew through a humbling and this transformative crises that tested every aspect of his being and incorporated almost every aspect of his personality traits. Kirk's speech at the end, at the rededication of the Enterprise, is a beautiful illustration of his integrated personality type. Listen to this. He says this: "There will always be those who mean to do us harm. To stop them, we risk awakening the same evil within ourselves. Our first instinct is to seek revenge when those we love are taken from us. But that's not who we are. When Christopher Pike first gave me his ship, he had me recite the captain's oath, words I didn't appreciate at the time, but now I see them as a call for us to remember who we are. Who we once were, and who we must be again. And those words, space, the final frontier, these are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise, her 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before." So, using psychological typology to trace the arc of Kirk's development from brash, playful, brilliant, adventurous, romantic, but irresponsible boy to seasoned veteran with a greater understanding of his own strengths and vulnerabilities, provides a vivid illustration of the power of understanding type in all its guises, recognizing the expression of the egosyntonic and dystonic functions and the functional attitudes through the archetypes. It's a really powerful tool for growth and personal development, to explore strange new inner worlds and assist in achieving one's highest potential and living one's life purposes with integrity and authenticity is our true final nature. So this is the process Kirk went through. This is the personality of Kirk. And this is a personality that was, yes, written into a fictional character, but portrayed by the actors who gave him life, and also linking us as viewers into some realizations that are supposed to be greater than who we are. In all of this, we brought up not just the intuition of Kirk, but all the irrational functioning that's often at a loss for logical explanation. The stereotype is only the introverted and extroverted intuitions and intuitives that come up with things that seem instinctual impressions out of the blue. But the reality is that the logical regularization sought by rational functioning to put not just coherency, but consistency and definition around irrational absolute experience is opposed quite a bit to sensation. So if properly viewed as an irrational mode of experience, if you say your typical person is an ancient society who might know the way about various neighborhoods without logically representing the path they take, say in a structured map or such, with a real down-to-earth connection to the physical cues, they also appear to just know. They just know things. They know, they're familiar with the territory. But the links are not unconscious, but physical. The former would be intuition. The case where it's easy to really string together the links into explanation is when the physical is abstracted into logical form. The idea that thinking and feeling differ by interaction versus description, or involvement versus representation, is also pretty key. The feeling is the function by which the human involves himself or herself into the situation. You separate yourself from the subconscious and you involve the conscious consciously, cognitively. And this is what Kirk did. Involvement, relatedness, whatever you want to call it. There's a mental aspect to that involvement, relatedness, which is what really evokes the feeling tones evaluated by function. Feeling tones, these things rise through physical involvement, which is a less mental, less intuitive form of relatedness. It's more physical, probably the one that Carl Jung noted most philosophers attribute feeling to. Likely, this is the kind of less differentiated feeling that Jung detailed, the feeling function form. So this is what we can pull from Captain Kirk. This is who he was, this is how he evolved, this is his personality type, and we're going to wrap our examination of Kirk, even though there's a whole lot more that could be said, but we start writing our own versions of fictional books if we do that via radio. So Kirk used typology. We've used typology to trace the evolution of who Kirk is and his personality type. He's the outward, energetic, heroic, romantic. But at the same time, he had to fall upon some of his darker things to learn how to be the better person. And perhaps you can learn something from Kirk and make personal application with that. So folks, that's it. That's all the time we've got tonight. Believe it or not, we're done. And we're done with Kirk. We're going to hop into some other things tomorrow. So I'm going to take a 23-hour break, and I'm going to be back. You sit tight. We'll see you tomorrow.